Well, howdy, everyone. How are you this morning? I'm James Foster, the director of the Institute for International Economic Policy, or IIEP as we call it. Welcome to the George Washington University and the Elliott School of International Affairs. We're really excited to host our 12th annual conference on China's development and U.S.-China economic relations. This year's conference follows the grand tradition of past conferences in convening a slate of brilliant scholars with unique insights on this most special of economic relationships, a relationship currently under great stress. Several of our participants are making a return visit this year. In particular, I want to bring attention to one of our lunch speakers who was in fact at the first of our conferences, David Shambo. So he'll be here at lunchtime to give his comments. I want to thank our partners, the Seeger Center for Asian Studies here at Elliott and GW Cyber in the Business School. We're also grateful for an array of generous donors, including the Ning Li Family Endowment. Before introducing our first keynote speaker, I want to give you a taste, just a taste, of what our institute does. From our unique location between the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the State Department, Treasury, the White House, the OAS, the Federal Reserve Board of Governors, to name but a few of our neighbors. IIEP is a research institute that serves as a catalyst for high-quality, multidisciplinary, nonpartisan research on policy issues surrounding economic globalization. Our four signature initiatives are U.S.-China economic relations, global economic governance, climate change in developing countries, and extreme poverty. We also hold dozens of events each year, including our annual conference on urbanization and poverty reduction just last September over at the World Bank, and the World Economic Outlook for the IMF held just last week, and many, many more. We hope you can join us for a future event. In addition to research and events, our faculty train the next generation of leaders. We are the institutional home for two programs, the Masters in International Economic Policy and the Masters in International Development Studies. And under the watchful eye of our operations manager, Kyle Renner, we have trained a battery of GW students to help faculty create new research and also to run our events. Our IIEP team is the best in the business. Kyle doesn't know I'm talking about him. He's greeting the guests. I'd like to take this moment for a second to thank Kyle and the rest of the team for making all this happen. Thank you, Kyle. Okay. Now down to business. Our first keynote speaker of the day is Daniel Zhu, who I have had the good fortune to work with over the last few years as part of a governmental advisory board. Daniel's extensive bio, like the bios of all participants, has already been handed out, and thus we shall dispense with the introductions. Daniel, you'll have about 25-30 minutes, which will be followed by some time for questions and answers. Please join me in welcoming Professor Daniel Zhu of Duke University to the podium. Daniel. Yes.
Okay.
Are you all ready?
All right.
Great.
Okay. I would like to thank James and Maggie for inviting me to present some of my research at this great conference. And I want to share with you some of my recent works about the fiscal policy and firm investment in China. And also, I look forward to hearing your feedbacks and a lot of your suggestions after this. So what's the general motivation of this line of research that I'll be presenting here? Is that the fiscal incentives are one of the most important government policy instruments in China, and just like the U.S., a lot of part of this kind of the purpose of that fiscal incentive from the government perspective is to try to generate stimulus that's going to kind of counter the certain type of economic downturns in the kind of short run. But also maybe aside differently from the U.S. perspective, a lot of the government fiscal incentives have also been used to kind of address market failure issues, and also try to promote growth. Okay, so during my talk, I'm going to give you two types of these type of incentives. The first type is recent value-added tax reform in China, and the second one is going to be to thinking about the R&D subsidy programs that is going to promote innovations in the China context. So why government has been very active using these incentives? One big reason is that corporate taxation has been a particularly active area for government at various levels. Partially because given that individual income tax system in China is way less developed compared with other more developed economies, we really do not have some kind of individual IDs tied with that. The system is building, but still, it's kind of lagging behind. So from a government revenue perspective, the value-added tax, which is a pass-through tax, and the enterprise income tax constitute two of the largest sources of tax revenues for government at different levels. Okay, and then at the end of the day, this is some kind of policy instrument that government has a lot of leeways that they could actually play with at the end of the day. But there's still an open question. First of all, what's the effectiveness of these programs? We don't really know how effective these things are, and the other thing is whether these kind of the programs being designed in an optimal way or not, right? So these questions does not only exist in China, but also exist in other countries. For instance, we do not know whether, so far, I guess at least we do not know the reason, like Trump tax cuts about corporate income tax, whether this is actually doing its job or not. A lot of that, at the end of the day, will depend on the firm responses, which is a kind of a universal type of issue that we should care about. But I would emphasize also, more importantly, in a lot of developing and emerging economies, the effectiveness of these programs also rely a lot on the government enforcement's capacity. Okay? And this is an angle possibly in the U.S. we worry a little bit less about. But in an economy like China, at different levels, what firm reports and how much being the reporting is completely real and how much has been just been invasion, turns out to be a kind of a very important issue for the government to consider too. And you will see, taking these considerations into account, we sometimes see seemingly suboptimal things being going on in China, which turns out with that background is a lot easier to understand and to rationalize. Okay, so that's the second theme I'm going to build into the second line of work I'm going to talk about today. Okay, so as I already said, to advise the better design of these fiscal incentives, you really need micro-level evidence. It's very hard to observe firm responses by just only look at aggregate data. So one important task for our research, as a general broadly, researchers possibly you will see again and again in this specific conference, is to obtain very detailed micro-level data, and on top of that, to explore kind of like a empirically credible identification strategy of firm behaviors with these data under some kind of policy changes, right? So this is the first thing I'm going to illustrate here is that data is important, and a credible identification is also important. So I'm going to the research here basically combines two broad sets of data. One set of data is the micro-level firm data that we got from the National Statistical Office of China, and the second set are actually the administrative tax records that were obtained from the State Administration of Tax from the Chinese government. And really we combine these, and looking at the detailed response of the firms can kind of shed light on a lot of these important questions I'm going to talk about here. But on top of data and this empirical identification strategy, is that sufficient? In fact, I'm going to kind of be an advocate to say that this is not. Okay, so these things are very necessary for us to get and handle about how firms be responding to different policies in a retrospective manner. But to give us power to predict and design alternative tax policies, we really need to put all these contexts into a specific model, which turns out to be the strength of economists. And by combining these quasi-random variations with a specific type of model that we can credibly validate using these historical episodes, that will enhance our ability to think about further policy design. right? So some kind of fundamental question coming out of this research is really about, once we take into account firms' response to this policy, we have to also thinking about the extensive margin, whether the firms actually are willing to participate in this specific incentive or not, right? We cannot like gunpoint these firms to say, okay, you have to. So we have to think about the participation decision. We have to think about the infrastructure, kind of infra-marginal firms, right? And then finally, as I emphasized, we also have to take into account the scope for evasion and avoidance in terms of once we start to design these kind of new tax incentives, okay? So basically, here I want to just give you like two examples to showing that, to tell a complete story, we need to combine the credible quasi-random experiment with some kind of structural model. Of course, I'm not going to get deep into the model, but just to give you a taste about what model can actually help us to do here. Okay. So here I'm going to talk about just like shameless self-promotion. There's two papers of myself. So the first paper is going to about the subsidy of the firm R&D activity in China. So this is the MBA working paper about notching R&D investment with corporate income tax cuts in China. Okay, so and the second paper is the one that I recently just finished. It's about a specific physical equipment investment stimulus program in China back in 2009. Okay, so this is a specific policy reform coming from the value-added tax. Okay, let me just start from the newer one and to tell you a little bit more background about these tax policy and how does that interact with the firm-level equipment investment. Okay, just give you some kind of broad picture view in terms of the importance of Chinese investment. By looking at this picture, it's pretty obvious. Of course, this red line is almost like everything in China. I can get rid of the label here and say this is something else. You will possibly believe me too. So this red line is basically the PPP adjusted trillions US dollars of physical investment conducted in each different country. Okay, so as you can see, starting from 2009, China's total investment has overtaken both the U.S. and the EU's in general, right? So this is just to understand the firm investment problem in China is a tremendously important issue, not only for Chinese economy but also in general for the world economy. And in general, when you think about firms' investment decisions, these are what we obtain from the microdata from the tax authority in China. If you look at the investment pattern and thinking about how much they invest, new investment, and take the ratio with respect to how much they already have in their stock. This is the investment to capital ratio, which you can see that is highly skewed. Okay, so that's why in general people considering investment to be lumpy in the sense that firms either conduct really big projects, right? You can think about these are kind of spikes where around like 20% of the firms, they kind of conduct big projects that kind of move their investment like really by a big fraction based on what they have, or they don't do anything. They really just do very little, which is like less than 1%, right, of what they have, possibly just kind of small kind of incremental type of maintenance stuff. So this basically tells us that this lumpy investment could reflect either there's a fairly large fixed cost at the firm that once they do big investment, they have to make a lot of design adjustment, right, to kind of disrupt their production to kind of make that happen, or it could be just they were hesitant because the new capital equipment price is actually systematically different from the old equipment price. And when the economy's been going up, they do want to put in more machines or more equipment like computer into their use, but they were worried that what if there happen to be a downturn, right? So then I cannot really resell my capital freely. That's why they were sort of hesitant on that, right? So the idea we want to convey here is that this partial reversibility, in general, there's a wedge between the new purchase and the sales. It's going to generate an inaction. And this is going to affect how tax policy to translate into the aggregate investment response of individual firms, right? So the idea is that if you shrink this kind of a gap between the new capital equipment price and the old equipment kind of resale price, then you're going to reduce this partial reversibility, and you'll be making firms more responsive to a lot of incentives we have in this economy. Okay, this is part of this. This is basically part of this study. Okay, so what's the basic policy context for this specific specific episode? Basically, in the year 2008, China, just like the rest of the world, having this downturn coming from the global financial crisis, and the government speeded up the tax reform. This is a highly accounting specific kind of sense, which is value-added tax. We don't really see that in the U.S., but we see that in a lot of other countries. In general, this is a pass-through tax, that meaning that whatever you spend on your intermediate inputs, okay, and you pay the tax on that, I'm going to credit back to the firm, such that you do not suffer the double taxation about both your output and your input. Okay, like most of the economy which has value-added tax, intermediate inputs actually was credit kind of like is actually eligible for this value-added tax rebate. Has always been that in China, but unlike a lot of other countries, China actually does not allow firm to credit the value-added tax they paid for new equipment. Okay, so that is driving essentially a kind of a distortion in the price that firms been paying for their new equipment. You've been paying a lot in terms of purchasing that, but you're not really allowed to take that back when you actually resell it. Okay, so the value tax essentially generates a wedge between these two prices, and basically prevent the firm from reacting to a lot of the good economic shocks that they face. Okay, so the idea of our project is to kind of evaluate whether this thing plays a big role in terms of understanding how much firm will respond to these value-added tax reforms. Okay, so let me skip over a bunch of details and just to show you one specific number here, which is how does this reform compare with some of the recent episodes we saw in the US. Okay, so in China in 2009, basically the government take out this value-added tax being charged on the equipment. Okay, we know that this is one type of stimulus program. One part of government's been kind of cutting down these frictions for the firm, but also try to stimulate investment at the firm level. How does that compare to some of the recent episodes in the U.S., for instance? It's more comparable if we think about that in terms of the user cost of capital, which is in words that is thinking about the per dollar kind of the per unit cost you're paying for each additional new equipment. Okay, so the most recent Trump corporate income tax reform, the TCJA, which that actually reduced the UCC, which is the user cost of capital, by 4%. Okay, and there's also the program that we documented in terms of the bonus depreciation of the capital, which happened in a lot of U.S. industries, including oil and drilling and a lot of these things. They in general reduce the user cost of capital by around 2.4 to 3.8%. And if you look at this one, which is the China reform, that is actually the one of the largest reform in magnitude in recent history that we can document for any other country. Okay, so this is around 15% of the user cost of capital reduction. Okay, so this is a big reform, and this is a reform that also simultaneously changes the wedges between the purchase and the resale price of the firms. Okay, now let's just look at how the firm responded to that, and again, jump over a bunch of regressions. I will just try to show you one bottom line number. This is, what we find is that in general, in terms of percent of firm that investing, it goes up by around 5% percentage point. Considering the fact that only 50% of the firms are actively investing each year anyway, that's a big rise. This is around 10% firm actually invest, going from non-action to investing. And the investment rate rose even more. The investment rate went up by 36%. Okay, so this is a big increase in terms of the individual firm response and in terms of the aggregate investment. But more importantly, just to summarize, where do these increase coming from? They're coming from the spikes. Okay, so if you document to look at where these, how the kind of the firm that engage in investment spikes, meaning that they invest in big projects. They invest more than 20% of their existing stock. Okay, so that's around 42% increase in the firms that now start to engage in investment spikes. And then if you combine this information, you'll find that overall these investment spikes account for 90% of the overall increase of these Chinese firms' investment changes. Okay, so that kind of come back to the bottom line message I'm trying to convey here is that spikes are really important. And spike doesn't happen very often. Spikes only happen when the firm knows that something good is happening, and also they know that the new equipment price will not be that different from the used equipment price because you are kind of shrinking the wedges between the phase such that they can respond a lot to these things. Okay, so once we have these retrospective numbers, one thing we did was to put all these numbers into a model that I'm not going to show you here, okay? Because because of time limit. But this is just to give you a sense about from the data, from the individual firm data. That's what we found for the individual firm's investment response. The blue line was a pre-reform level in terms of investment ratio at the individual firm level, and the red bars are the ones that post the reform. Okay, you can see there's a big increase, and a lot of that happening at the right tail. Okay, and now I'm going to just fast forward towards just one intuition that I'm trying to show here is that what's happening. What's happened here is that when these firms who's having a very good productivity shock here, okay, they have a new product, they have some new ideas. What they used to do is that because they know they cannot really get rid of this VAT tax, okay? So they basically sit on it, right? So there's a very much big flat line there. But what goes on here is that when the VAT gets reformed, they shrink this part. And a lot of firms on the right tail now start to actively investing in a positive amount, right? That's the economic intuition coming out of this model. So this model possibly takes a long time to solve on a computer, but this is just one figure to kind of summarize the basic idea of that and what the firm's been doing. And how successful the model is, basically once we estimate the model, the green bar are the ones that we predict from the model. Okay, so basically we write down the whole set of model of decision by the firms, and we feed in all the information that we had, but we didn't tell the model how firms should respond. And we feed in the tax reform in the model. And the green bar is the response of the firm in our model that's been predicted once we feed in the right amount of tax reform, right? You can see that what is going to be a good check for a model that we're going to use in advising for the policy design. What we need is that this green bar to be getting close to this red bar as much as possible, because we know that the red bar is something that really happened, that we use data to quantify in a credible way, in a statistical way. So the green bar is the one that kind of help us to validate, how useful our model is. I can say, it does a pretty good job. I won't say perfect. If it's not kind of completely spot on, but I think in general it fits the red bar really well. Right? It gives us a lot of confidence to think about this specific economic channel that we think about, that cutting the VAT is going to help us to reduce this partial reversibility of investment decision. Turns out to be very important here. Okay, so what's the general takeaway from there? The general takeaway is that, in fact, U.S. doesn't have VAT. You say, okay, if I look at the U.S., why should I care? But you have a lot of things. You have something that look a lot like VAT. What is that? That is investment tax credit. Okay, so this is what we predict in terms of per percent changes of the tax revenue you lost from the government perspective, and the vertical line is the percent change in the investment rate that you're gonna, in the aggregate, that you will be able to stimulate using this amount of tax revenue loss. Okay, so VAT, if you look at the red line, it's a lot more effective than the corporate income tax cuts. Okay, compared that, here we cut the corporate income tax. And versus the VAT is a lot more effective. But can we replicate that? Yes. We could use the investment tax credit. Okay? Investment tax credit is going to act almost as if a VAT cut, because it's also going to change the wedge between the purchase price of new equipment versus the resale price of the used equipment. And that will help us again, squeeze this inaction region of the firms, promote investment spikes when we have certain tax incentives, and make everything work. Okay, so I hope I convinced you like this is going to be a very useful study, not only about China, but also in general for kind of tax policy in a lot of different countries. Okay, now let me move on to my second theme is about firm evasion and the government's capacity in kind of thinking about that in designing their policy. Okay, so the second project I'm going to talk about is the Chinese stimulus program for their corporate R&D. Okay, again, I'm going to show you, as usual, the aggregate level R&D activities. This is also, I'm not going to talk about trade. We have a lot of great speakers down the line. I'm going to also talking about trade. Intellectual property issue is going to be also a kind of a key tension in this whole debate. But despite all these things, what you can look at from the raw data, the R&D to GDP ratio in China has been just growing dramatically in the past 2 decades, right? So it started in the same level as like India back in 1996, and now it's very much similar to the level of Canada. Okay, still below the U.S., but Canada is like the OECD median level. So China is an OECD median level innovation intensive economy if you measure just by the aggregate. Okay, all right. So then, a very natural question is how much of that is actually really real R&D? How much that is just Chinese firms being kind of claiming something's being R&D? All right. So this is a question that almost like whenever we talk to people will have on mind. It's like, really, you are an innovator or not? Okay, I think it's very useful to kind of use some of these data to kind of shed light in terms of how good are these data are. We know that we took them from the World Bank, but World Bank likely took that from Chinese National Statistical Office. So it'd be useful kind of to dig deeper into the micro data to kind of look at it. So this is what we did. I'm not going to put too much emphasis on this. On this data, just to tell you this specific program I'm going to talk about because I have maybe like 5 minutes here. So the program I'm going to talk about is actually called the InnoCom. Okay, so the InnoCom is one of the major tax program in China today for firms. Okay, so as I told you, corporate income tax is the second largest revenue source for the government, and this is the largest program that government spend these resources on firms. Okay, so how do they spend it? Essentially, what they did was to say, if your R&D to sales ratio goes above a certain threshold, I'm going to reduce your corporate income tax in a lump sum way that goes from the statutory rate around like 33% all the way to 15%. So this is like a half, this is a huge cut, like 50% cut of your corporate income tax rate, flat, if your R&D to sales ratio achieves certain threshold, and plus some auxiliary requirements. Okay, this is before 2008, and we're going to focus on after 2008. The reason is that after 2008, we can now, using our unique data, we can start to detect a lot of interesting things that firms do. Okay, so what happened in 2008? In 2008, basically the government says, okay, I'm going to change the enforcement and change the rule for this program. Okay, so what they did is they basically says if you're a very large firm, maybe achieving 5% is very hard for you. So and let me reduce this threshold to be 3%. If you're a medium-sized firm, let me put that at 4%. And if you're a really small firm, I put the threshold at 6%. Okay, so these kind of like differential threshold actually make it very interesting for us to look at the detailed firm responses. Coming from like what do they do really in terms of reporting in terms of these thresholds. Okay, so here is what I gonna plot here. This is complete data. We didn't do any processing. This is like what we take the data from the Chinese state administrative admission of tax, okay, and plot the density. This is like for those of you, all thinking about this like a histogram, right, of the R&D to sales ratio in our data. Okay, this is possibly the most interesting density I've seen, coming from the raw data for those of you actually who work with data, right? So the Chinese R&D intensity has 3 peaks. Okay, it actually peaks at 3%, peaks at 4%, and peaks at 6%. Okay, so it's not smooth. you can see a lot of a lot of jumps. Typically we call these bunching, right? So these are the bunching patterns of Chinese firms. We always joke that they know how to follow others, right? So and when you look at where they bunch, they basically know that exactly right? So these are the large firms. The large firms do not bunch at 4, 3. Sorry, these are small firms. Small firms do not bunch at 3 or 4%. They bunch at 6%, right? These are the medium firms. These are the large firms. Okay, firms are smart, right? So you have the policy. Firms going to respond, and they're going to respond in a way that they're going to be exactly at this point that they're going to get you a tax benefit, right? So this is not crazy. We can see if they were really doing that. This is great. But another piece of evidence I want to show here is that, in fact, there are also other things that firms can do to actually achieve this. Okay, they don't necessarily need to invest in real R&D. They can do other things on their book. Okay, so after talking to a lot of the, like the accounting executives who has to be not be cited their names, we sort of figure out the game. Right, the game is that you have these expenses of R&D. You kind of put them together and call that administrative expenses. Okay, so but administrative expenses is really broad. In addition to R&D, any kind of secretary use, any of kind of office equipment, any of transportation equipment, any of the other things, you also group that together, right? So the idea is that I have this whole category, and how do I classify that is really important to be thinking about what is the R&D investment here. And now here is a graph that what we did is to look at within that category, what happened to the non-R&D expenses when the firms are kind of getting closer to they need to be certified as a high-tech firm and get a tax break, right? So just to show here that, just give an example. For instance, if we have the large firm, the firm needs to get 3%, right? So all these non-R&D expense to sales ratio being very, very stable, okay? All the way until this 3%, and suddenly there's a discrete drop, okay? So what's going on here is that, as you could guess, once I'm getting very close to this threshold, I look at my R&D expenditure, it's kind of not enough for me to qualify for the government program. But why don't I call my secretary R&D workers, and then call my computer equipment to be R&D expenditure, and then kind of put them all together, that's my R&D. So that will get me up on that line, okay? But all my other expenses are gonna just discretely drop here, okay? And you can see, depending on firm size, the small firms, you do not see drop anywhere other than 6%, and the medium firm, you do not see drop anywhere other than 4%, and large firm, you do not see anywhere other than 3%, okay? So you can see that how firms been combining the real R&D responses together with accounting tricks, achieve that threshold, right? So that is something I really just want to emphasize that I don't have time here, but when we think about the firm behavior, they could combine a whole set of real R&D and evasion decision to achieve that goal and to take the tax cut. So once you evaluate the effectiveness of this government policy, you really have to take this kind of behavior into account, and that's the reason why I kind of build we kind of build a model for that, right? So I'm a bit running out of time, but I just want to say that once you actually build a model for that, you could really look at, in terms of the kind of fraction of firm that how much fraction of this R&D being reported is real and how much is actually just being made up by the firm. And coming out of the model, what we found is that around 30% of the reported R&D on average among these firms is actually just simply relabeling. Okay, so around 70% that is still real, around 30% is basically coming from some other accounting expense categories at the end of the day. And when government been thinking about these policy, now we think about why China has this such unreasonable program, right? We're so used to things that thinking about R&D tax credit. This is totally non-distortionary. Whatever firm do, I'm gonna credit back a certain amount of R&D expenses back to the firm. That's what we do in the US. Why Chinese government have been using such a stupid policy, think about certification? But then when you think about enforcement under this kind of evasion behavior, that starts to make a lot more sense. Because if you think about R&D tax credit and think about the span of the government capacity in auditing all of these firms who have been reporting R&D expenditure, you really have to rely on enormous resources, right? These certification program that is a little bit ad hoc and have to set things in a threshold, but the firm that self-select into the threshold is a much smaller set compared with all the firms that have been doing R&D. And if you have limited auditing resource, at the end of the day, this type of program might not be completely stupid. Okay, so actually there might be sounds like a pretty smart choice. And in some of the model, we show you that under certain scenarios, this could be dominating the R&D tax credit system. Okay, so at the end of the day, I'm saying here is that we really need to be careful thinking about when we think about the policy design, thinking about the firm selection into this program, thinking about firm behavior is really important. Take us a lot to use the kind of microdata to understand that, but it's a really rewarding avenue, I think, in terms of research, and also on top of that, in terms of policy making in the future. Okay, all right, thanks a lot. Okay.
Thank you, Dan. Right, so we have a Q&A time. Questions? Slow on the uptake today. Great, in the back. Yes, please. You can't see him, but he's right behind you. Yeah.
Okay, Stanley Cobra, can you go back one or two slides when you had the productivity number? No, not that. Okay, there. Let me see. You have the productivity 9.64%. I'm curious, how can you get it so precise? Down to, 0.64?
Yeah.
I mean,
So this is based on some statistical analysis that we think about from basically two layers, right? One is that once we have that program, we can go to these firms by adjusting for their selection decision. We can look at before and after the program, how much does their productivity change? That's one variation we can look at. And the second thing is that even from their R&D responses, once you adjust for relabeling, from their responsiveness, our model can also tell us the number. We will basically combine these two pieces of information together, and that's what they tell us about how much benefit do I need from these R&D for me to invest this much. By having their complete data so we can measure them. And given that measurement, we've been looking at how they do actually respond to these programs. And this is a number we get from our statistical analysis. Does that answer your question, or this is something still vague? Okay.
Question over here. Yes, please. Chad. And you can give your name out as you.
Chad Bound from the Peterson Institute. So fascinating work. I think you ran out of time, though. I want to hear about the policy implications of this last set of results you have. So even if it's just kind of theoretical, how we're supposed to be thinking about that, what are some of the trade-offs that you have in mind? So this is, an improving improves, you would tend to want to move away from this kind of system. How should we be thinking about that as policymakers?
Yeah, I think as I emphasized, a lot is related to the government's enforcement capacity, and a lot of the things that Chinese government has been doing is to kind of try to put all the, first of all, try to make the auditing system a lot more automatic, and they were trying to make the large firm now kind of submit their information into an electronic system, right? So this is almost the first step that you do have to, if you want to do auditing, this is the first step about self-reporting. And the other thing is that there's a lot of digitization about the VAT records, which is going to be having detailed transaction of firm to firm. If you want to make up some expense, that expense will have to go to somebody, and you have to need somebody else, the third party, to get that verifiable. And once you digitize those things, once you make that into a whole electronic system, and that will make the enforcement capability of government will be significantly improved. And I think the third thing that they're trying to do is to kind of thinking about these statistical capability used to be vary a lot across different regions, because a lot of the regions have their own administrative Administration of Tax and also the National Statistical Office have like different branches. The ability of those things usually differ a lot. For instance, we know that the GDP number coming from province is kind of heavily inflated. From some of the major cities like Shanghai, Beijing, turns out to be usually very accurate. So these kind of like regional disparity also matters a lot. I think kind of harmonize that from the central level would also improve that. So I think there are different stages that the government could potentially do to kind of make these things a lot, basically less costly and make the enforcement a lot easier. And well, maybe at that point we can thinking about moving towards a more efficient tax system that's much less distortionary, right? Because we know that in these notches, definitely we're still distorting people's decisions here.
Yeah. Question in the back? Yes, please.
Thank you. My name is Martin Burville. I'm just a parent. I'm curious on the first, not this scenario, the one you mentioned earlier about VAT.
Right.
Because it implies a cash focus, whereas in the businesses I've worked in, it was about depreciation, and the issue was you couldn't write off your existing equipment, and so you carried it on the book. So it was a P&L issue. It wasn't a cash issue. But when you talk about new investment and resale, we just wrote the old equipment off. We didn't have a resale consideration at all. So I'm concerned that I may have misunderstood. Are you talking about a cash profile, or are you talking about a P&L profile?
Great question. In fact, the first part of what you described is also in our model, but I didn't put emphasis on that because the depreciation schedule definitely matters, in the sense that the only way that corporate income tax is going to matter there is because the corporate income tax is going to affect how quick you could depreciate. Will actually matters in terms of the current kind of like a present value of this phenomenon that you described. And the fact that the government typically give people bonus depreciation is exactly because of this reason, that you could expense these depreciation earlier and save your tax burden based on the corporate income tax. That's still in there, but the corporate income tax for China doesn't change that much. So I didn't emphasize that part, but that's also another consideration in terms of the tax cut benefits.
Yeah, because in terms of competitiveness, in the West, it's about depreciation freeing up P&L for new investment.
Right.
And if you don't have any investment, that's fine, it's all new. Mm-hmm. But I was just curious about how that relates to China versus the Western economies in terms of how old assets can be written off and new investment comes. And the challenge I always faced was we couldn't write the old assets off fast enough.
You couldn't.
We could not write the old assets off fast enough because tax policy wouldn't permit it.
Right. This is the same for Chinese firms. Actually, that's what I'm saying, that Chinese firms facing the same problem that you described, and on top of that, they also face this additional VAT problem. That the government tax reform basically addressed the VAT problem, but didn't really. But the same issue that you described still exists for the Chinese firms. They did have a slight corporate income tax cut also back in 2008 that helped on this depreciation issue, but I don't think Chinese government had any kind of this type of comparable bonus depreciation program that usually they use like 10-year straight line depreciation. So they do have a lot of policy scope to kind of think about things there. But as also mentioned, things will only be comparable when you start to think about the present value of the cost of per unit of capital you've been investing in, and you put them into the user cost of capital sense. This VAT cuts implication is way larger than a bonus depreciation. So I give one example of the bonus depreciation that reduced that user cost of capital by around like 3%. But the VAT cut reduced that by 15%. So that's a huge deal, actually. Yeah.
Right over here. Steve?
Hi, Steve Saranovic from IIEP. So you talked about how having the different policies at 3%, 4%, 6% could be a smart policy in sense of auditing and being able to identify where there's mislabeling and so forth, and that's what you use to kind of identify that, right? Mm-hmm. But I noticed your data ended in it looked like in 2011 or so.
Yes.
So there's been almost 10 years since then.
Yeah.
To your knowledge, has the Chinese government initiated audits of this policy? I'm wondering what the penalties are for firms that are caught sort of relabeling? What are the consequences of doing that? And have they sort of, used that to their advantage to be able to single out and maybe prosecute firms that are mislabeling their R&D?
Yeah, I hope they could start to. Our paper just got started to circulate like last year. So, of course, I heard they start to notice that, but I haven't really been. But before that, the general punishment is about you will be disqualified from applying for this program for the next few years. And I think for the typical firm, this doesn't sound like a harsh enough punishment in general. So, once in a while, firms that were listed, news media would actually disclose that, this firm being actually punished for making up its innovation expenses. And for those listed firms, the results are a little bit more severe because the stock market actually will also respond to that. But in general, I agree with you. There doesn't seem to be a very systematic design in terms of what is the kind of the punishment mechanism that will prevent firms from actually doing this type of relabeling, and it will take a lot of thinking. Yeah.
So we have room for one more question, short one, or we can stop. 1, 2, 3. Oops, there you go.
It's related to the first study about the VAT reform. So it seems to me that VAT reform is quite specific. It's to give the equipment credit for VAT. So I wonder if the model developed based on that case, can that be transferable to other types of VAT reform to advise the policy?
Right. As I said, I didn't get time to get to the model, but I think the model is pretty general. In fact, most of the macroeconomists in our Federal Reserve Board, possibly they'll be working on a similar type of model into firm investment. The change we made was to making the capital price subject to this value-added tax wedge that specific to Chinese policy. But as I said, there are a lot of counterpart to that. For instance, if you think about anything that's going to change the purchase price of capital, for instance, investment tax credit, in our model, that will act almost exactly like the VAT. The only difference is back to that gentleman's questions, investment tax credit is not going to have an implication for your future depreciation, where the VAT will have more settled implication for your future depreciation because it entered the book value of the capital equipment that you purchase. But in general, from the model perspective, they're very much comparable. That's why I'm saying the model can still be used to even advise policy reform in other countries, because even you don't have the VAT, even the VAT is not distorted, you can still think about investment tax credit or other policy that could mimic a very similar impact that we documented here. Yeah.
Well, please join me in thanking our speaker, Daniel, for his wonderful presentation.
Yeah, thank you for your question.